Hey, how you guys doing? I wanted to give you my 6 reasons why I think Linux failed on the desktop for the mainstream consumer. Or basically why it wasn't adopted widely, something like Windows and or Mac. Of course, Mac has a much smaller, maybe what, 10%, or and then maybe Windows 90%, something like that. In fact, Linux probably has less than 1%. And just to let you know, I don't hate Linux. That's not the reason why I'm doing this. In fact, sometime after Windows 95, I discovered Linux and I used it for 16 years straight. And then I kind of transitioned to Mac for video production and other things. And if I stopped using Macs for whatever reason, I would actually go back to Linux, just to let you know. So I'm going to give you reason number one. Too many choices. I think there are way too many flavors of Linux for the average user to really choose. And I'm not talking about applications, that's something else. Um, I mean, some were designed to actually run off of a USB stick and not necessarily being installed, or Slackware, which is really a command line terminal type of install, which is very hard to use for the average consumer. So I think if we narrow down to a few choices, it would be a lot easier for consumers to decide this daunting task. Okay, my second reason is support in both software and hardware. Software so much as perhaps some of their favorite third-party applications that they run on Windows or even Mac. They may not necessarily be supported in their Linux. Yes, there are alternatives, obviously, but a lot of times people have to have that for work, or it could be other reasons why. Um, Now, going into hardware support, that's something even harder, perhaps. In fact, a lot of times when I use Linux, I would have to do research on if I wanted to get a specific piece of hardware for my computer to ensure that it had drivers and it worked, or what I would have to do to get it supported or running in Linux. And sometimes even then it makes it even harder. Even if it does have supports, give you an example. Supposedly, let's say you're a gamer, so you want to install, latest NVIDIA, or even perhaps I don't know, AMD, just depending. A lot of those, of course, they do have proprietary drivers. Either from their website, from the company website. I mean, yes, there are some Linux distributions where they'll search, see what card you have, even download the proprietary open source and many other things. But usually if you're a gamer, you want the actual drivers from the company, either NVIDIA or AMD. And even when you download it, it's run by a script file, making it a lot harder to install unless you know the terminal, which goes down to reason 4, a learning curve. And just I give you a previous example, installing natively from the website the drivers for your graphics card, so you can get acceleration and better gaming frames per second and all that, or even get your game to work. It's very daunting to try to get things to work, and sometimes you have to go drop down to a terminal. You got to run it as root, and it's just long and drawn out, and it's not guaranteed to even work. Not only that, it's finding how things work. Generally, you can't do it necessarily through a Windows or even Mac way of thinking. You have to think how Linux works. And if you're used to, even if you're really good at DOS, drop down to a terminal. Linux is going to be different. It's based on Unix. Some commands are similar, others are not. And I actually, when I learned, I actually had took a crash course in using the Unix terminal just to, in case I had to use it for installing things or whatever. Number 5, limited support of applications. Well, I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, but of course you do have hundreds and thousands of even free software you can download through their distro server. It installs fairly easy. A lot of them or most of them, I would say 80%, maybe 80% kind of suck. And I kind of knock it down to a couple for each application, more or less. You may be able to find some more that aren't, intuitive enough, work great, good interface. I also found like the interface kind of sucks in general for a lot of the operating systems and kind of lacking. While most of these come from the developers themselves, they're great at developing the operating system itself. But they kind of suck at making a great interface, graphic experience for the regular consumer. And I found that actually lacking over the years. The longer I used it. And number 6 is high maintenance. For instance, installing certain third-party applications. Obviously, hardware things tend to break a lot easier than Windows and Macs, and it could be with a system update, operating a new version of the operating system. Of course, I'm not talking about on the pro level. Of course, same thing with Windows and Mac. You have to wait till supported drivers. If you're doing it for work, obviously you want to make sure all that's supported as well. But I find Linux breaks a whole lot easier, and you got to be careful where you download it from. And there's a way you can get it from different servers to get certain applications that aren't natively supported in, for instance, Ubuntu may not have that software you're looking for. So you're going to have to add repository for that particular application, which can actually break your other applications by utilizing different libraries. Or even put older or even newer versions of support libraries which break your system. So those are my breakdowns of why Linux is not hasn't really gained traction for the average consumer, mom, pop, brother and sister, and so on. But I'm gonna give you some reasons how you can that can change, where it would be a lot more widely adopted. First thing is not good. All developers go to one distro and one distro only. That way they can have a unified distro for support, drivers, and everything else. And also one window manager. Of course, you can run multiple window or different window managers. Could be, it used to be GNOME. For instance, GNOME, Enlightenment, KDE. Stick with one, or take one and stick with it, and also the same distro. And then once you do that, make it as streamlined as possible for the African consumer. Make it as easy as possible, and then I think you would see mass-wide adoption. Now, of course, looking back, I did talk about where a couple of videos where Windows, uh, there was some rumors going around that perhaps they could go to a paid operating system for the average consumer. I didn't really think so. I think that was more for the business user, but even if that did happen, then I think we would see more migration to a Linux type system. But like I said, to gain max traction, you would need to go down to one distro, one window manager, and streamline the heck out of it. Well, that's my video for right now. Thanks for watching, and see you guys later.